Thank you very much for the warm words. Very pleased to be here. And let me thank Sebastian Fabrizio for this fantastic conference on a very, very timely topic, very important topic. And I'll do my best to live up to the high expectations you've raised, Sebastian. I certainly have done some work on inequality, some academic work over the past years. And it's a particular challenge and also like a great sort of intellectual stimulus, thinking about inequality. I'm more or less, you can call me a macroeconomist, one that cares about distribution, but linking it to the business world, linking it sort of more to the origins of inequality has been a fantastic journey. Let me take you on this journey and let me start with something that I think Fabrizio and Sebastian both mentioned, that the question of inequality in societies is as old as I think human thinking. I mean, we're starting here with ancient Greek, and Plutarch said an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. And keep in mind, this is an old Greek person says this, and he also thinks this is very old as a topic. So, how old is it in reality? It's been one that has been constant in 20th century thinking, especially with the Industrial Revolution. Question of inequality, of great differences in income and wealth has become a standard question in social policy, social thought. If you think about, I come from Germany, not only Germany, but Germany has a very long tradition of social democratic parties, and Britain you have the Labour Party and others. This is an early incarnations of this struggle over fairness and justice in society. So Louis Brandeis, a famous American activist, said we can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. Brandeis, I think he died around probably like in the early 20th century. He didn't know about Elon Musk and Peter Thiel being among us, but he clearly, these things do not go away. I think Marx said history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and this is clearly a rhyme of history. Nelson Mandela, and I think I'll talk about the global perspectives a little bit. The Kiel Institute is the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. So we are indeed, as Sebastian said, Germany's main academic research institute, looking at all kinds, all global, international questions. I know that Germany can be very parochial, provincial, and inside turn, but we try at least to break that ice and think in the bigger context. So Mandela said we must work together to ensure the equitable distribution of wealth, opportunity, and power in our society. And he mentions these three important words. No, it's about opportunity, it's about wealth, and it's about power. The link is I think something that has been has dropped out of until recently, until Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez and others have reignited interest in inequality trends, and Thomas is a good friend, and I'm a great admirer of his work. These were things that had dropped out a little bit of the economic canon. We haven't taught macro with distribution. Now we teach macro with distribution again. And I think that's a big step forward in the sense that, ideas really matter. And what Thomas and Emmanuel and Gabriel and others have done has really changed our thinking about many things. Let me start with some philosophical backdrop for you. The problem of social justice, of course, is not just occupied economists. It's also been a philosophical question, maybe one of the philosophical questions par excellence. Sebastian mentioned the arc of this conference. There is this saying by Martin Luther King that the arc of history bends towards justice, and the question of justice and what is a just society, of course, is extremely fundamental and old. And I think the most influential, and you probably know all of this, but I'll refresh your memories. The most influential contribution, modern, we had after Plato and Aristotle and all these ancients, was by John Rawls, American philosopher in the late 20th century. I think he died a few years ago. And he had this genius idea of saying, like, imagine we all came together and had to decide what a just society is without knowing where we end up later in life. So we don't know who we are, like where we're going to be. We don't know where we come from. We don't know where we go. And we just come together in this room and we have to decide how would we structure society. And it's not clear that who's the dean and who's not. We don't know that. How would we think about? So you had this thought experiment. How would we think about a just society? And this famous veil of ignorance. So we don't know. We don't know where we come from. We don't know where we go to. What would be the principles that smart, rational people, cooperative people would agree on? And I can't give you this. The theory of justice is a 600-page book, but essentially the idea is, he says, like, what we would do as rational individuals is we would say that to the extent, and this is the thing we could all agree on, to the extent that there are inequalities in the real world after we come out of this room and we then see what happens in the real world, we would only agree to having inequalities to the extent that they help the least advantaged in society. The idea here is a very smart one if you think about it. He says, like, we want a society that only has inequalities to the extent that it actually helps the poor. And that's slightly more paradoxical, but what he means by that is we want to have a society that has the necessary dynamism and the necessary diversity and opportunity for people to go their own ways, but only to the extent, and that leads to inequality, and we'll tolerate that inequality, all of us, because we might end up being poor and at the bottom of the distribution, so we would agree to having these inequalities if they ultimately benefit us. This differential principle has become very famous. I'll give you one illustration. I don't know if you see this, but this is US data from the 1950s, I think, to the 2000s, roughly. And it shows you what consumption possibilities poor Americans had. Americans below the poverty level, so it's 1997. So it's not the most recent data, but it doesn't matter for the argument. Sense like it shows you what could poor Americans below the poverty level, what access to what appliances, consumption goods did they have in 2000, and compares that to all US households 50 years earlier in 1950. And the argument here is that, broadly speaking, you can see that even the poorest American households today, 20 years ago, had more access, more consumption possibilities, all these nice things like, flush toilets and refrigerators and everything, than the average American household had 50 years earlier. So there's been a development of the economy, of society, that was to some extent beneficial to those who were below the poverty line because they now have more possibilities than they did before. And that's kind of like the essence of the Rawls argument. Of course, America is an unequal place, but we tolerate these inequalities because ultimately it benefits those at the bottom. The question is, and that's the big question, Rawls, did it benefit those at the bottom the most? And this is where big questions come in. So what you see here is a real household income. This is again for the US, for different percentiles of the economy, and you see that the 90th percentile and the 95th percentile are the richest 5 and richest 10% of Americans. And you can see from 1967 on towards 2011, those households really had very, very high income gains, whereas for households at the median household basically increased its income in real terms from $42,000 to $50,000 per year, whereas for the 10th percentile, so the poorest 10%, things remained more or less stuck around $10,000. So here's the question: we've seen growth in the American economy, and while something has trickled down, it hasn't trickled down in a way that it benefits those at the bottom the most. And I think that's the tension that we need to think about. And it's at the bottom, if you scratch of all inequality debates, if you meet a hardcore neoliberal economist, he or she will tell you we need inequality as an incentive device, because without the possibility to be different, to have different ideas, to live them, to have different lifestyles, to put different effort, you don't get the dynamism in an economy that you need to grow. On the other hand, and that's equally true, these inequalities can become so large that they don't end up anymore benefiting those at the bottom. So the trickle-down idea, Rawls is not a trickle-down idea, by the way. It's an idea where Actually, the inequality is justified only to the extent that those at the bottom benefit over proportionally, also meaning getting higher income and higher gains than those at the top. So something, even by a very generous, I think, interpretation of inequality and the roles in perspective has been criticized by many, because it says, like, we need some level of inequality. The optimal inequality is not zero, or like, equal distribution of everything. Even by this generous definition of inequality, we have not performed particularly well in the past 40 years, because the gains from a growing economy did not benefit those at the bottom the most, they benefited those at the top the most. Okay, so with this introduction, let's go into what economists love to do, namely talk about data and sort of facts. And when we do that, we need to differentiate what kind of inequality do we look at. And these things blur sometimes. They are related in various ways. I don't think I have time enough to write you down a model how income and wealth inequality are related, but there are models of that, and of course these concepts are related. But first of all, there's wealth inequality, which is, looking at your bank accounts, your houses, your stocks holdings and whatnot you have, and you can look at how wealth in a society is distributed. If you want to know how wealth inequality changes over time, you want to look at three things. You want to first look at inheritances, because that's how many people get a head start in life. You want to look at the returns on existing wealth, which is, you inherited a house or something, and then that house might appreciate in value. And you want to look at new savings. And new savings, the income that you receive that you don't spend, is the part that links the income and the wealth distribution. Because the more income you get, the more you can save, the richer also you become in terms of wealth over time. I also already mentioned income inequality, which is, I think, the one, Sebastian mentioned it at the introduction. If you think about the role of business, it's probably the one where businesses are most affected, because you pay the salaries, you pay the wages that are different for different groups of people in your companies. And that is, I'm not saying it's causing, but it's on a descriptive level, that is the income, the wage inequality that we measure in the data. And you would say it's very natural, I have to pay a software engineer, I have to pay her a higher salary than maybe the janitor. And you'd say, like, this is just what the market is, but this is exactly what we mentioned, Fabrizio mentioned in terms of pre-distribution. These are the raw data that that businesses, that the economy generates. And then there's the question of redistribution, which is we have tax systems that, charge different tax rates on different salary types. You know that because you all pay taxes. And to some extent, and some societies are more successful than others in using the tax system to redistribute the unequal pre-distributed incomes. So we will look at before and after tax income, and we'll make a big difference, because one is really the market-driven inequality. This is the labor market that you all operate in. And the other one is the inequality that we observe after the political system takes some money from this group of people and gives it to others. If you go down the chain of inequalities, typically in societies, wealth inequality is the highest. Income inequality is lower. And if you look at consumption inequality, it's even lower than income inequality, exactly because there's some redistribution happening. So if you compare incomes with what people then actually, or pre-tax incomes with what people can actually spend and do, you go down. And then there's a big and hard to measure, but very, very, very important dimension of inequality, and I think Fabrizio mentioned it, it's inequality of opportunity. It's one of the great myths that we will ever have something like equality of opportunity. It's very easily said for any politician, but it's basically impossible to generate. And I think we should be fair to say, like, all the societies that have tried to do it also failed. It's not an easy problem to solve. Think about Plato. He took away the kids early on and put them in some school, so everyone had the same starting chances, and people also don't like that. So it's really an open question. But I think it's fair to say that in the economics research profession, not many people believe in we all believe in the ideal of equality of opportunity. But I think all the micro studies about early childhood education, the role of parental background, the role of schooling, tell us it's a total myth that we have anything close to equal opportunity, even in sort of rich and Western societies that spend on education. I don't want to bore you with numbers, but the Gini coefficient is something that is so central to measuring income inequality that you should probably just have it as and it's important for the numbers and slides I'm going to show you a little bit later. The Gini coefficient measures how much the distribution of income or the distribution of wealth or the distribution of anything you're interested in really in society is away from a perfectly equal distribution. So in a perfectly equal distribution, you see there's half of the population who have half of the income. You would be on this 45-degree line, and just everyone would have the same. Half of the population would get half of the income, 20% of the population would get 20% of the income, and you have a straight line, and it's an equal distribution of resources. In reality, you get in societies that, basically all societies that you can look at, you get something that is less than an equal distribution. And we've talked about roles, probably for good reasons, because there is some, we want to be different. This is part of free societies, is also that you make different life choices, and you cannot equalize over everything. So in reality, these 45-degree lines are never reached, and you get a line, this is called the Lorenz curve, that is somewhat below that. And the Gini coefficient effectively just measures how far away you are. It takes the integral over these areas, but that doesn't matter, how far you're away from that degree line. The larger the zone A is, this between the 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve, the bigger the inequality, the greater the inequality in a society. So high Gini, more unequal; low Gini, less unequal. And this is around the world. I mentioned the great work that Thomas Piketty and his team have done in Paris at the Paris School of Economics. So if you're interested in data, go to the World Inequality Lab, it's called. They collect data that I've done and produced in my research and others, and bring them out. And you see here income inequality for the world, you see it for the EU, you see it for Latin America, the US. And generally speaking, Ginis are somewhere in the range between 0.3 and 0.6. That's sort of a range, with 0.3 being low. Most sort of the northern Scandinavian European countries have relatively low income inequality. And you see up there the continent with the highest inequality, and I'll come back to this because it's one of the most famous examples for which Nobel Prizes were given, how inequality really matters for long-run economic development. The most unequal continent is Latin America. Everyone else is somewhere in between, and you see if you look at world inequality, it's been rising, and I'll also come back to that in a moment. So we mentioned pre-distribution versus redistribution. This is a chart for the US showing you both, showing you income inequality for three groups. For the richest 10%, that's the red lines. For the middle 40, that's basically the middle class, and then for the bottom 50, the bottom half of the population. And you have these solid lines and the lines with the circles, and the lines with the circles are after the tax system, so that's post-tax inequality, and the solid, the little pyramids, the triangles are pre-distribution inequalities. And you see, look, just focus on the bottom right corner, how the bottom half, this is the half of the US population, how the income share that the bottom half of the population gets in pre-tax has fallen from somewhere like 20% in the 60s and 70s to roughly a little more than 12%, 13% today. So a big drop, almost the halving of the income share going to the bottom half of the American distribution. So keep in mind, when we say bottom half, that's half of all Americans. That's 170 million people, 160 million people. So 160 million people basically seen their share in total incomes in the US drop almost by half in the last 50 years. It looks a little bit better. You jump up by, roughly maybe 10 percentage points of total income when you look at the post-tax income. It's actually one of the interesting facts that the American tax system is not bad at redistributing from rich to poor. You might say it doesn't do enough of that, and it still generates far too much pre-tax inequality, possible. But it's actually more effective than many European countries in redistributing from the very rich to the very poor. Look at the red one. This is the top guys. This is, just to give you an idea, pre-tax the richest 10% of the Americans roughly got 45, close to 50% of all income in the American economy. So 10% of the population, half of everything. It's going to be even more concentrated for wealth. So these inequalities are really large, but you also see, like, for the richest top percent, the American tax system does an okay job, actually, could do more, I guess, but of reducing it. And you see that for the middle class, for that, turquoise, bluish line, the two are pretty much on top of each other. So the middle class in America, pre-tax and post-tax are the same. They don't receive a lot of redistribution. Different to a country like Germany, for example, where a lot of the redistribution actually comes through the middle class. Taxes are very high on medium or middle class earners and not very high on top earners. So the US system, from that perspective, is not bad. Here's France. You see similar trends. Overall speaking, in European countries, the bottom 50 have higher income shares. You see there's a little bit more of taxation of the middle class in France than it is in the US, so it lowers that, and equally of the top 10, but overall speaking, among the Western economies, the US are the most unequal. Okay, let's talk about wealth, and let's talk about one aspect of wealth that research for a long time ignored. And Sebastian mentioned that I've done a little bit of work, and if I have any claim to fame in this literature, it's that, namely, when economists until maybe 8 years ago, 10 years ago, looked at the link between income and wealth, all they looked at was basically how much people saved. And no one looked at the wealth they already had and what the rates of return are that people get on existing wealth. And if you do that, you come to very, very different conclusions about the drivers of wealth inequality, because the appreciation of existing wealth, that could be business wealth in the form of stocks, or housing wealth in the form of apartments in Barcelona or elsewhere, and houses, has by far exceeded, in most countries, the role of savings, of new savings, in the wealth accumulation process. So if you want to, this is a winded way for an economist of saying, if you want to understand wealth inequality, you need to understand what assets people hold. And I can tell you an example from Germany, which is infamous among economists for basically having a culture that until today tells low-income people to put their money in a savings account in the bank. And that's a very bad idea, because that money in the savings account in the bank will not appreciate in value. If you're lucky, it will stay the same. If you have inflation, it will actually become less in real terms. That means that wealth growth at the bottom, it's actually, I'll show you the pictures in a second, wealth growth for the bottom half or the bottom of the German income distribution has been extremely low. Spain has gone a different way. You have very high home ownership rates. So most of the wealth, even for people not at the very, very bottom, but in the bottom half, is concentrated typically in real estate, with rates of return, with price appreciation over time that far exceeds what you can get in a savings account in a bank. So we need to understand why people save the way they save. Why do some people buy stocks, and some people buy houses, and some people put their money in a savings account? And here, there's actually one very, it's intuitive from, if you think about it for a second, but it's taken like many discoveries in I guess in social science quite a while to figure out. But if you think about why you save, it has a lot to do with you want to have resources in case you, for example, you lose your job. So you want to have some savings you can draw on. So then it really matters if your savings are risky or safe. If you imagine there's a recession, you're a low-income household, and you lose your job. So now you'd say, okay, there's some unemployment insurance, etc., but let's assume that's not there. Then you really need to be able, in that moment when you lose your job, to draw on your savings, because that will sustain you and your family, or that will help you repair your car to find a new job, or whatever. But what does the stock market typically do in a recession? Well, it drops. So if you're a person that is at a high risk to lose her job in a recession, it might actually not be a very good idea to save in the stock market because your income goes away because you lose your job, and at the same time that happens, your savings drop in value. So in economic speech, that means income risk and the asset you own are correlated, are highly correlated. Meaning it might be, if you think about who has a high risk of losing his job or her job in a recession, it's not me because I'm a professor. It's going to be very hard for the German government to get rid of me. It's probably not most of us. It's typically low-income people. So low-income people are the first to leave the firm because, firms and businesses, because, skill sets and this is like the part, you see it in the data, the unemployment risk is very high at the bottom of the distribution. These are the people that are let go very quickly and not at the very top. So that means actually that for those people it's quite rational to some extent at least to put money in the savings account because they really need it when they lose their job. Which in turn means, and that's something that's not very nice about capitalism, that income and wealth inequalities will perpetuate. Because poor people will put their money in savings forms that earn them low returns in the long run, meaning they will never catch up with the rich ones. And why do they do this? Because they can't otherwise. Because they need the money right there when bad things happen. So they don't have the luxury that probably most of us have to say like, well, God, the stock market drops 30% in a recession. So what? It will come up again. So these are real linkages between income and wealth where inequalities are built in and where I think policy has a big role to play. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you about home ownership rates. There's Spain right in the middle if you look at it, and there's Germany right at the bottom. Of course, things like home ownership rates, because that's the main form of wealth for people outside of the top 10. The top 10 has a lot of business wealth, you own companies and they're very valuable. But basically for everyone else out there, people have some stocks but mostly the big asset for the middle class is the house. And the more you spread home ownership, the more you prepare the ground also for low income or medium income people to accumulate wealth over time. And countries like Germany, for example, have failed to do that. Often with, often with intentions that sounded good at a time. So there is a famous quote by Engels, the guy from Marx Engels, the co-author of The Other Guy, who said, like, you can't give the workers houses because they will lose their revolutionary spirit if you do that. And actually, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan exactly had the same thought and said, like, we're going to give workers a lot of houses because it will turn them into conservatives. And, I think both were right. It's right, but I think what both did not understand, because they were focusing on the politics of it, is that, of course, it is a form of wealth building, of wealth accumulation. And Spain has done much better, and I'll show you here. This is the wealth share of the bottom 50% in total wealth. So you take half of the German population and half of the Spanish population, and you ask what share of the total pie do they own? And on the left hand is Germany, and you see in 2020 that was about 3.5%, and in Spain it's about 7%. And at the peak of the housing boom, I know you had a housing boom, and I know property can be risky, etc. But still, even if you look through that, and I think many of you now look back at the past 30 years and think like, yeah, there was this crazy housing boom and bust, but overall it was still not the worst investment. So the bottom half in Spain have a wealth that's about twice as high as that of Germans relative to the total wealth of the country. And the main reason is that you've had policies and maybe also a culture, or not the culture that was an impediment to not accumulating wealth through house ownership for the bottom 50%. Okay, let's talk about drivers of inequality and then the consequences in the last 10 minutes or so. People debate, of course, why inequalities have risen. Showed you the figures for the world, for the US. For some European countries, actually, it's not super clear that overall income inequality has exploded, but it's a global trend that is very well established that inequality has been rising. Partly, it is very shortly, it's partly, if you look at wealth inequality has not, if you look at Spain, for example, it hasn't risen that much for the same mechanism that I just talked about, because the bottom 50% have participated in the increase in property values much more than they have, for example, in Germany. So in Germany, wealth inequality has increased much more. So what are the key reasons? Technology is one of what we have to talk later, because with AI and the rate of technological change, everything that we thought about technology in the past 30 years, the computers and the automation, the robots, etc., will pick up in speed. And it will pose a major challenge for inequality. And I think if I have one question for you I want you to take home is, I guess many of you have kids, so they're already too old for that question, but think about what you would tell your kids right now which job they should have in 20 years. What is a job that's going to be safe from AI, that's not going to be controlled by some gigantic computer learning system that can be replaced? It's probably not a lawyer. It might not even be a doctor. It might not even be a professor. And the best I could come up with is like a barkeeper, It's like, cocktails and sociality will always. But I mean, think about it. It's not an easy question to say what jobs are safe from that ongoing technological change. Anyways, there is another reason for inequality, which is one that economists are focused on, are worried about, and it's true exactly, especially for the US, where corporate concentration has grown, and with corporate concentration, market power has grown, and hence the possibility to squeeze out more profit. And then there's one, declining unionization. I think that is a trend across countries. I don't know the Spanish situation very well, but it's clearly visible in Germany. The industrial union culture of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s just has dissolved to the extent that, even in Germany, industry is less than 20% of the GDP now, of the total economy. It's no longer the dominant, well-organized collective form. And of course, that might have contributed to lower labor incomes. And then there's one that's globalization. And I want to talk about globalization because there's a lot of, I come from an institute that looks at the world economy, and B, I think it's one of the, if you take Rawls seriously, then from a global perspective, who we should care most about are the world's poorest. So the question, has globalization benefited the world's poorest, is a very fundamental one and a very important one. The problem with that, it sounds much easier than it is to actually measure global inequality, because you can have very different concepts. And I show you this. The first concept is where you have these slightly inappropriate caricatures of Chinese, or like a European, I guess a Chinese and American, or I think, that's what it's meant to be. That's the world where you just compare inequality of countries. But that would mean you give Luxembourg and China the same weight. So probably a little bit dodgy, because it doesn't account for the very big population differences in these two countries. That you can do in the second one. You can still compare inequality between countries, but you weigh them differently. So the observation of China is about a million times has more weight than the observation for Luxembourg, but you still you still aggregate or average Gini's for individual countries, but you just give them different weights. And the third is the most demanding on the data side, but the most interesting, where you just think the whole world economy is one big society, and it doesn't matter if you're Chinese or Spanish or Catalan or German or whatever. You can go through, you just build a distribution of all people in the world, and you don't pay attention to nationalities. And these three concepts give you three very different answers. If you look at concept one, inequality just between countries, globalization has not performed well, because the West has become richer and some of the poorest African countries have just become poorer, at least not richer. If you do concept two, China and India play an enormous role and inequality has fallen. And if you do concept three, where you also account for the fact that China and India within themselves have become more unequal as they've become richer, things look pretty stable. At least not much has happened. And I think that is, with all its criticism, a fair thing to say that globalization, at least from that perspective, the last 20 years have brought a lot of, have highlighted, also because communication and science have globalized, has highlighted a lot of the inequalities, but mainly owing to the partly very different economic model of China and to some extent India and their successes and the large numbers of poor people they've brought out of poverty, the last 20 or 30 years look pretty okay. I'll show you the most famous graph of all that many of you know, the so-called elephant curve. Branko actually is a good friend, and I think they were with his wife. They were in Barcelona until not so long ago at Pompeo. You were here, okay. So Branko has put together this amazing curve that's become very. Some people like Martin Wolf at the FT called the single most important charts in economics that you have to know. Unfortunately, things have changed a little bit in the last decade. I think also for Branko says like this is not as clear anymore. But what does this show you? It shows you this number 3 concept of inequality. It looks at the whole distribution of people in the world and looks which part. So here on the left-hand side are the poorest in the world, and on the right-hand side are the richest in the world, and just shows you how their incomes have grown in the between 1980 and I think 2010, and 1980 2008. Sorry. And it's called the elephant curve because it looks a little bit like the elephant. It has this is the idea. What does it mean? It means that the world's poorest, and then here you can then struggle a little bit with Rawls, have had very low income growth. But then there's this big back of the elephant where income growth was very, very high, 60, 70, 80%. That's the success of China and partly India during this period. Because on the global scale, China, of course, is still a reasonably poor country. So in the global distribution, the Chinese middle class is probably now around like 35, 45 percentile of the wealth distribution. But then there is this like trunks, if you will, where things really go down the head of the elephant. And this is between the 75th and the 85th percentile of the wealth distribution. Income growth was negative or zero, or basically negative. And which population is concentrated in that, or which parts of the population are concentrated in that? This is blue-collar workers in Western industrial societies. These are the people who have been put in competition, if you will. Technology has played a role, but do have put in competition with this enormous workforce in the rest of the world, and then it shows up again. And these are the Ronaldos and the Britney Spearses of this world and the Elon Musk of the world, who with globalization all of a sudden are no longer just Portuguese football stars, but global superstars. Their market has exploded by an infinite number, and they've become much richer. So Branko has updated this for the last 10 years, and he sent me this like last week. And now for the last decade, the orange curve, and the orange curve looks a little bit different. So we have to really see how this goes, because what has happened is that since the financial crisis, some of the Western economies have not done so well, especially if you look at Europe. Income growth has been meager, and India has caught up. So the elephant curve is not is not an iron law of history. It describes the world between sort of China, the opening of China under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, and the global financial crisis. Since then, things have. If this is true, we've lived in the best of all worlds. Obviously, income growth is very high for the poor people in the world, and not even very high for the Manhattan finance types. But let's see if that stays in the world. Okay, last point in the last a couple of minutes is, why do we care? And what are the consequences of something that is happening under our eyes? It's a little bit like the frog, that you in the water pot and you turn out the temperature and the frog doesn't notice until it's too late and the water boils. I think that's like a little bit the comparison with inequality. We see it, a lot of these indicators slipping. But it's not really clear why we would be concerned about this today. And I think this is what Sebastian meant in the introduction. It's like, you put a seed here and you think about it. It's nothing that, next week we will all go out and change about, but it's something where we should be mindful and understanding that these are slow-running processes in the background that have the potential to change the world we live in quite substantially. And I give you the famous example. Latin America, I said earlier, it's the most unequal continent on the planet. And there's a very famous hypothesis from economic history that explains and causally links inequality in Latin America with the relatively, let's call it, disappointing economic performance. What is this table? You don't have to look at the numbers. It's just to show you that in around 1700, Latin America was actually rich and North America was poor. And within 200 years or 300 years, this has completely changed. Now North America is very rich and Latin America still struggles in large parts. And what Stan Engelman and Sokolov said in their famous hypothesis is this is because of inequality. Now, I'll give you the chain of reasoning. Chain of reasoning is that the conditions in Latin America, the climate, made it particularly prone for slave agriculture, sugar canes, etc. What does that mean? So, companies went there and people set up and bought these large, or received these large plots of land, implemented agriculture using slave labor. And that meant that from the beginning on, Latin America was an extremely unequal society. And what happens in an extremely unequal, because there's like one master and a lot of slaves, it doesn't get more unequal than that in reality. So the consequence is very high inequality. And what does that mean now for political and institutional development in Latin America? It means that the elites have very little incentive to invest in the broader masses. You have this conflict, you have a constant struggle over how much participation do you give to these sort of to poor people in this very unequal, even after the abolishment of slavery, to these very poor parts of society. So instead of opening up and letting all these poor people participate, Latin American institutions have become famously exclusive. The school system was never built up. The party systems still rely more on sort of elite contacts than on true inclusion, etc. And Engelman and Sokolov say, well, this is actually the deep reason, because Latin America has never, or many countries have not managed to build up the human capital, to invest in education, and to build stable policies, because from the onset, the continent was so incredibly unequal. So here is an example, clearly, for how much inequality is too much. And it's also an example for what can happen if inequality slips further. And this is a chart that shows you the share of countries in the world that's governed by populists over time. And it starts in 1900 and it ends today, or like 2 years ago. And there's something very striking here, which is that, we had this very bad phase for democracy in the 1920s and 1930s. Across Europe, I'm German, I know what I'm talking about. But right now, we are in a world where the peaks of populism that we had in the 1930s have already been, surpassed. More countries are governed by populists right now than they were in the 1930s. Maybe they're not as bad as those in the 1930s, who knows, but the fact that something slipped and our democracies are on a way towards more and more polarization and populism is undeniable, and we have American elections coming up. I'm not going to go through all these names, but what you can see is like once you let a populist come to power, think about Argentina or think about Bolivia, they always come back. Populism is serial, so it's really important not to get the first one into office because something breaks with the body politics. What happens when populists come to power? And that is interesting, I hope, for you as business people and people being close to the economy. Populists in power are bad business. At least for the economy as a whole. There are always some that are very well connected. You just have to look at Hungary right now or Putin's Russia. Of course, some companies do well because they have political connections, also a very dangerous life, so I would not recommend that. But overall, economic performance under populists, and it doesn't matter if they're left populist or right populist. We have a problem in Germany right now, and you kind of barely distinguish them because they say the same thing. Is equally bad, and countries lose growth rates roughly 1% per year. And if you lose 1% per year over a decade, your GDP per capita, there's a gap of 10-15% that opens up. So electing populists, and you get into the spiral where something slips on your socio-economic fundamentals. The politics polarize. You elect a populist. The person mostly he implements policies that are detrimental to growth in the long run. And why is that? Well, first of all, populists don't help the people they pretend to help. Inequality doesn't change under populists, so they don't keep their promise of helping the people, whatever the people are. And what they do is they do lasting damage to the things that we think as economists are really key for long-run development, namely having competition, having a free press, having fair elections, having good courts and a fair legal system. This is what you see here. So 0 is the year where the populist comes to power. And you can see how on all these indicators, after a populist takeover, things really deteriorate. And we think, and we argue in this article, that this is the main reason why populists, when they come to power, are so bad and underperform economically. Look at Berlusconi in Italy, look at Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, even Trump he claims he was the greatest president of all times, of course, but if you look at the data, there wasn't much of a difference to Obama, etc., etc. Why is that? Well, they often become protectionist and they do something like America First policies, which are detrimental in the long run. Or B, like in Latin America in the 50s and 60s, they run crazy fiscal programs and inflation rises. Pick your poison, but there is no evidence that electing a populist will help the people or the economy. I'm at the end, and we're here. I have taken 2 more minutes, but so what are the conclusions? I think the one key idea I want you to take home with is, except for asking what your children should become in an AI-dominated economy, is that high levels of inequality breed volatile politics, and volatile politics ultimately lead to bad economics. So high inequality is costly. I have not given you an answer what the optimal level of inequality is. And some, I think, reasonable people also make the argument that, some of the dynamism that you need for social change will, at least in the short run, contribute to inequality. And so optimal inequality is not 0, but it's clearly also not at the high levels that we see in many countries. There is the redistribution versus pre-distribution aspect, and I think this is where business comes in. I think if I have one advice for you, it is, and there's a clear link between income inequality, skill, and wages and skills, is to invest in your people and make sure they get educated. The best insurance against becoming poor is having a good education and being updated and trained and investing, and then getting workers and employees that are become more productive and hence get higher wages, and inequality falls. So the importance of education and all of this is really, really central. I think about AI and what it means, and I think I talked to you through this example that poor people, for good reasons, maybe save in ways that lead to low long-run returns because they need the money when they need it. I think that's one of the most complex and striking injustices and inequalities. And Rawls would have said this shouldn't exist. So anything, and I know whenever I say this in Germany in front of audiences of company owners and business people, they don't like to hear that, but inheritance is a big thing, and I know that many try to get their life's work to the next generation, and I totally understand that. I probably want to do the same to some way, and it's very human. But I think we should be fair and say, like, this is unearned wealth to a large extent, and our kids probably have a head start in life anyways in many ways. So I think higher inheritance taxation, as hard as it is something that most economists would agree on. It doesn't distort incentives, and it helps. There are interesting ideas from the US, especially in the racial justice debate, to give every child from a certain background a so-called baby bond, some starting capital of whatever $20,000 or $30,000 to start with. So there's something that wealth accumulation can start with. That also maybe the idea is they can't touch it until they turn 18 or 21 or whatever. But the idea that people know there is something, and if I gain in financial literacy and I think about I can grow this and how to invest, and you get people that are far from these questions into thinking about building up wealth. And I think from the data also I've shown you, wealth accumulation at the bottom is really the big question, where most societies have done very poorly. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to take more time. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to it.